The entire internet labeled me a heartless scumbag as I stood in the defendant's dock for a life sentence trial. My wife stood there arm in arm with my brother, publicly dragging my name through the mud while the public's rage reached a fever pitch. In the face of a brutal sentence, I pushed through the agony and formally requested a memory extraction to broadcast the absolute truth to the world. I was the most hated man on the internet, standing trial for my very life. I had been hauled into this courtroom by Ava, the woman I had spent years loving as my wife. She was absolutely convinced that I would be too cowardly to ever show my face in this place. The moment I stepped into the dock, the atmosphere in the room turned to ice. Every face in the gallery was a mask of pure shock and disbelief. They all assumed I had come here to hang my head in shame, plead guilty, and quietly accept whatever punishment they threw at me. They had no idea that I was actually there to reclaim every single thing they had stolen from me. Before the proceedings began, the judge looked down with a grave expression and asked if both the plaintiff and the defendant fully understood the stakes of this trial. If the plaintiff lost the case, every cent of their assets will be transferred to the defendant along with a criminal sentence. He was interrupted before he could finish the thought. If the defendant lost, he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ava sat in the plaintiff's chair and glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. She looked at me as if I were a complete stranger rather than the husband who had stood by her side for all those years. Right next to her, a man had his arm draped casually over her shoulder as if he owned her. The man was Ethan, and he acted with the intimacy of a devoted husband. He shot me a sideways glance that was both arrogant and taunting, clearly signaling that he thought he had already won. The judge turned his attention back to me and prepared to speak. I lifted my chin and met his gaze with steady eyes, stating firmly that the trial should proceed. The gavel slammed onto the bench with a heavy thud. With that sound, the trial of my life officially began. The first charge Ava leveled against me was the abandonment of my parents and a total failure of filial duty. The court clerks activated the projectors, displaying the grim details of the accusation across the massive screens. Meanwhile, a secondary monitor flashed a relentless stream of live comments from hundreds of thousands of angry people watching the broadcast. Is that really James Sterling, the oldest son of the Sterling family? I cannot believe he is actually being sued. No way. I used to be such a huge fan of him and Ava as a couple. I guess looks are deceiving because he seems like such a gentleman, but apparently he is rotten to the core. As the hate comments flooded the screen, Ethan looked absolutely delighted and let a smug smirk crawl across his face. He pulled Ava even closer to him in a possessive embrace. I tightened my grip under the table until my knuckles turned white. Every one of my alleged crimes was laid bare for the public to see on the screens. A video began to play showing a frail, white-haired man who looked like he might collapse at any moment. His misty eyes stared directly into the lens as heavy tears began to track down his face. His voice was thin and trembling as he spoke. James, she was the one person who truly loved you. She was your own grandmother who raised you from a child. So how could you find it in your heart to leave her in a shack in the middle of nowhere to die alone? Do you even have a soul? The jury box immediately erupted into a wave of hushed, judgmental whispers. Ava gripped the edge of the table so hard her fingers turned white, her face a mask of performative agony. Ethan leaned in to pat her shoulder, whispering sweet nothings with a gentleness that felt entirely staged. While the room was distracted by the video, he let a small, private smile slip out. He made a show of adjusting his cuff, making sure the light caught the ring on his finger so it flashed brilliantly in my direction. It was a blatant display of his claim over my life. I responded with a cold, silent sneer. People like him were barely human if they could find joy in a moment like this. The comment section was calling for my head, saying a life sentence was too merciful and that I deserved to be executed on the spot. While the internet vitriol reached a fever pitch, the judge signaled for the technicians to bring the specialized equipment forward. The court technicians rolled the machine toward me and began attaching a complex web of electrode wires to my body. It was a cutting-edge memory extraction device designed to pull every single core memory from a person's mind while simultaneously acting as a flawless lie detector. I had heard rumors that most people who underwent this procedure ended up confessing just to make it stop. The sheer agony of the process was supposedly beyond human endurance. Ethan and Ava clearly hadn't expected me to volunteer for this because Ethan's expression soured instantly. Ava continued to glare at me with a look so sharp it felt like she wanted to tear me apart with her bare eyes. From the moment we walked in, her gaze had been nothing but pure hatred. I could practically hear her thinking that she wanted to see what pathetic games I was trying to play now. I looked the judge in the eye and gave my firm consent to begin the memory extraction. A heartbeat later, a wave of white-hot agony crashed over me like a forest fire. It felt as though a serrated blade was slowly carving through my internal organs. Every second of the process felt like a slow, agonizing death. While I suffered, the images being pulled from my mind were projected in high definition onto the massive courtroom screen. The first memory took me back to the 3 years my parents were divorcing when I was living with my mother at her parents' house. My grandfather was a classic old-school sexist who had no respect for my mother, which meant he had no time for me either. My grandma, on the other hand, was my entire world. She had this incredible talent for taking the simplest ingredients and turning them into meals that I can still taste if I close my eyes. She was strong and full of life, and she used to take me down to the creek in the summer to catch crawfish. She would spend hours laughing and playing with me. Sometimes she would stroke my hair and whisper in a voice as soft as a summer breeze that I was her bright moon and her absolute favorite person in the world. By the time I was 13, I was old enough to understand the bitter silence and the shouting matches between the adults. I knew that every time my grandma snuck an extra piece of meat onto my plate, she would have to endure a barrage of verbal abuse from my grandfather later. I would just lie there with my head in her lap, feeling the comfort of her rough, hard-working hands against my skin. Those calluses were the physical record of a lifetime of manual labor. Back then, I made a silent promise to her that I would become someone important, so she would never have to work again. She would just give me that warm, weary smile and tell me that my love was all she needed to be happy. The memories flickered across the screen like a rapid montage of bittersweet moments. I have always prided myself on my composure, but seeing my grandma's face again, so full of love and years of hardship, broke something inside me. I couldn't stop the tears from falling down my face. Seeing those memories even made Ava's eyes well up with tears. It was undeniable how much my grandmother had loved and shielded me. The live comments went wild with speculation, but I noticed that Ethan's expression was growing darker by the second. People were commenting that it seemed impossible for someone with such a loving grandmother to turn out so evil. They called me a monster and a traitor to my own blood. Every new comment was a fresh wave of performative outrage directed at my character. I watched the hateful words scroll by without feeling a single thing. The screen shifted to my 16th year when my father finally showed up to find my mother. He pulled up in a luxury car that cost more than our house, dressed in designer clothes that looked completely out of place in our neighborhood. He stopped right in front of our crumbling little gate. He was carrying a young boy who was dressed like royalty, and that boy was Ethan. I was standing off to the side, looking like a beggar in the oversized hand-me-downs I had inherited from my uncle. My grandma had spent hours patching those clothes, but next to Ethan, I looked pathetic and absurd. My parents were screaming at each other in the yard, while my grandfather played the role of the groveling servant, bringing my father tea and nodding like a bobblehead while trying to play peacemaker. He actually told my mother that in the old days, men were expected to have multiple wives. He said my father only having one mistress wasn't even that bad compared to some men. He looked her in the eye and asked if she was really his daughter, telling her that if she was, she would shut up and go back to her husband. My mother looked like she had turned to stone. I watched her from behind the door, seeing the absolute void of emotion on her face. She watched the chaos unfold with a cold detachment, as if she were a spectator at a play that she found incredibly boring. My father put on a masterful performance of a grieving husband swearing up and down that he had ended things with the other woman for good. Eventually, my mother gave in and walked to the car. As I sat in the plush leather seat of that expensive vehicle, I pressed my forehead against the glass. I watched through the window as my grandmother stood by the gate, wiping her eyes with her apron. She stood perfectly still, watching us until the car was nothing but a speck in the distance. It wasn't until we rounded the final corner that she finally disappeared from my life. Living in a mansion wasn't any better than living in that cramped little house with my grandma. I spent years just trying to survive the Sterling household. When Ava and I finally got married and moved into our own place, the first thing I did was insist that my grandmother come live with us. By then, her health was failing, but I didn't care about the cost because I finally had the money to get her the best medical care in the country. I never saw it coming when Ethan somehow manipulated Ava into letting him move into our home. She told me that he was my brother and he was lost after being away for so long. She claimed my father was too busy for him and my mother hated his guts, so I was the only family he had left. That was the excuse Ava used to force him into our lives. Every instinct had told me to say no, but I kept giving in to Ava's demands. I gave Ethan the guest suite, bought him the most expensive linens and tech, and made sure he had everything a person could possibly want. He didn't show a hint of gratitude and instead treated our home like a hotel he was reviewing. He eventually stopped in front of the master bedroom I share with Ava. He walked right in, stared at our wedding portrait on the wall, and told me with a sickening grin that he wanted our room instead. I was speechless because there was no way he didn't realize that was the most private room in the house. As the tension reached a breaking point, my grandma appeared in the hallway. She pointed a shaking finger at Ethan and told him to get the hell out of James's house. Ethan jumped, then turned a look of pure disgust on my grandmother. He asked her what right a servant had to raise her voice in his presence. My grandma didn't even bother to correct him about her status. She just took a silent, defiant step toward him. She literally shoved him toward the door and told him to leave. I caught her before she could overexert herself and looked Ethan dead in the eye, telling him that she was my grandmother, not a servant. Right as I said it, Ava walked through the front door, completely oblivious to the confrontation. She stood in the foyer and asked what all the shouting was about. Ethan's face transformed instantly from malice to a mask of wounded innocence. He looked at Ava and apologized, claiming he had mistaken my grandmother for the help and didn't mean to upset me. He sighed and said he would just leave since I clearly didn't want him there. Ava turned her annoyance on me, telling me that it was perfectly understandable that Ethan didn't know who my grandmother was and asking why I was being such a jerk. I tried to explain that he was the one who started it. Ava cut me off and told me that she would handle Ethan from now on and that I should stay out of it. She turned and walked away with him, leaving me standing there. Watching them walk off together felt like someone had dropped a boulder onto my chest. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed in total silence, knowing there was no point in arguing. My grandma came in and wrapped her arms around me, whispering that I deserved so much better than this. She told me that if it got too hard, she would take me away from this miserable house for good. Long before I was born, she had bought a tiny cottage upstate as a retirement dream. But after decades of a soul-crushing marriage and raising a child, she had never actually set foot in it. The place had sat empty for years, just a forgotten memory in the back of her mind. Looking at her tired, wrinkled face made my heart ache. We made a pact right then and there to leave this place and move into her cottage together. We wanted a life where we didn't have to walk on eggshells or depend on the fake generosity of people like the Sterlings. I never thought Ethan would find a way to ruin even that. On the afternoon we were supposed to leave, I came home from work to find the house completely empty. My grandmother was nowhere to be found. I searched every room and interrogated every member of the staff until I finally got the truth. Ethan had taken her out early that morning. A wave of dread washed over me as I scrambled to call Ava. Her phone went straight to voicemail every time I tried. Desperate, I called Ethan, and to my surprise, he actually picked up. He sounded completely unfazed and told me to meet him at a local coffee shop. When I got to the cafe, Ethan was sitting there with a grin on his face. He told me that since my grandmother wanted to leave so badly, he had done me a favor and dropped her off himself. The dread in my stomach turned into pure, cold terror. I demanded to know where he had taken her. He just shrugged and said he had driven her about an hour out of the city and left her in the middle of nowhere. He claimed he didn't even remember the exact spot. I was absolutely horrified by what I was hearing. He had actually abandoned a sick old woman on the side of the road. I saw red and lunged across the table, grabbing him by the throat and slamming my fist into his face. I didn't even look back as he hit the floor. I just ran for the door. I drove like a madman through the outskirts of the city for hours. It was nearly midnight when I finally found her in an abandoned industrial lot. She was curled into a ball against a cold concrete wall, looking so still that I prayed she was just sleeping. It was a freezing winter night, and for a woman in her condition, it was a death sentence. She was gone. When I finally made it home with her body, I didn't find any sympathy, only a house full of people ready to tear me apart. My father didn't even let me speak before he backhanded me across the face so hard I saw stars. He screamed at me, asking if I was even human and how I could be so heartless to leave my own grandmother to die in the cold. I just stared at him, my brain struggling to process the insanity of the situation. I tried to tell him it was Ethan, but no one would listen. My stepmother looked at me with a look of utter disgust and said she had always thought I was the good son. She just shook her head and turned away as if I were something she had found on the bottom of her shoe. Ethan was actually standing there faking tears, telling everyone that I should have taken my anger out on him instead of an old woman. As the room erupted in insults directed at me, the realization finally started to sink in. Ethan had planned the whole thing to make me the villain. I turned to Ava, my voice trembling, and asked if she believed me. I had momentarily forgotten that she had never once taken my side in all the years we were together. She just looked at me with total contempt and told me she was moving into the guest room. The memory feed suddenly cut to black as the physical agony of the extraction process began to ebb away. I was drenched in sweat and gasping for air as the courtroom came back into focus. The gallery was buzzing with conversation, and I noticed the jurors were casting suspicious glances in Ethan's direction. The live feed was a chaotic mess of comments. People were saying they had never seen anyone as depraved as Ethan. He was being labeled as the most disgusting man on the internet in real time. The public was calling him a monster and saying he deserved a life sentence. Ethan's face went pale, and he reflexively pulled his arm away from Ava. Ava was staring at the screen with an expression of total, frozen shock. The judge didn't give the room a chance to process before moving on. The second charge was for aggravated assault resulting in permanent disability and infertility. The screen shifted to a new memory of Ethan sitting alone on the edge of a high-rise rooftop at night. He looked like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Suddenly, the memory version of me charged out and grabbed him by the shirt, throwing a punch. Ethan scrambled to defend himself, and we ended up in a desperate struggle. During the scuffle, he lost his footing on the ledge. In a panic, he lunged for my arm and dragged me down with him. We both went over the edge together. The memory blurred and then refocused on a sterile hospital room. The doctor was shaking his head, explaining that the fall had caused severe trauma to Ethan's pelvic region. He told the family that Ethan would likely never be able to have children. Ethan was lying in the bed, looking like a broken, pale ghost. He was shaking with pain, but making sure to look as pathetic as possible. Ava was right there by his side, whispering comforts and holding his hand. They looked like a devoted couple facing a tragedy together. I was standing in the doorway in my own hospital gown, watching them like a ghost at my own funeral. The internet was having a field day, with people saying they finally understood why Ava hated me and calling me a piece of trash. The comments were asking what kind of monster could do that to his own brother. They were disgusted that I could stand in court and pretend to be innocent after ruining a man's life. The screen was a wall of pure vitriol. One commenter pointed out that I had basically ended his bloodline. They called me a poisonous human being. The sarcasm and hate were relentless. Not a single person in that courtroom or online had a shred of sympathy for me. As far as they were concerned, I was a villain who had snapped and tried to murder my wife and brother out of some twisted sense of revenge for my grandmother. The cold metal probes bit into my skin again, tunneling along my nerves to force out the next set of memories. It felt like I was being dissected alive with a dull blade. The pain was so intense, I could feel my consciousness starting to slip away. I dug my nails into my thigh to stay awake because I refused to show even a second of weakness to Ava or Ethan. A new memory flickered onto the screen. It was our 3rd year of marriage, the year we found out Ethan was moving back to New York. Ava didn't sleep a wink the night she heard the news, just sat on the sofa staring into space until the sun came up. I was just as wrecked, unable to close my eyes. I knew the only reason she had ever married me was that I looked a little bit like him. Ava would never have looked at me twice if I didn't remind her of him. I had been in love with her for half my life, and when they broke up, I was the one who picked up the pieces. I was the one who helped her find her smile again and get back on her feet. I wasn't stupid. I knew she still carried a torch for him. But when I finally worked up the courage to propose, and she said yes, I was the happiest man alive. I had no idea that our little bubble of happiness had an expiration date of exactly 3 years. The whole family went to JFK to meet him when his flight landed. The second he stepped through the gate, he started scanning the crowd like a predator. His eyes didn't stop until they landed on Ava. He lit up with a grin the moment he saw her. I tried to stake my claim by putting an arm around her, wanting to remind him that she was my wife now. Ava didn't even give me the chance before she was already moving away from me. She walked right up to him and took his bag as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She was all smiles and sweet questions, showing him a warmth that I hadn't seen in years. She was a completely different person around him. It was a brutal reminder that I was just a placeholder. All the love I had for her felt like ash in my mouth in that moment. I had been naive enough to think that a marriage certificate actually meant something, that it was a reality he couldn't touch. I told myself that if I just loved her hard enough for long enough, she would eventually love me back. That pathetic fantasy died the day I saw Ethan walking into the OBGYN clinic with my wife. I found the ultrasound in a drawer when I got home that evening. She was 2 months along. Ethan was waiting for me, stubbing out a cigarette on my floor and looking at me like I was a bug he was about to crush. He told me I was slow for just now finding out. He bragged that the baby was conceived the very first night he got back to New York. He laughed in my face, saying that a piece of paper didn't stop Ava from running straight back into his arms. He mockingly told me he wasn't even mad about it. He said that once his son was born, I could serve as the boy's bodyguard. He thought it was hilarious that the heir to the Sterling and Harrison fortunes would have his pathetic uncle as a servant. He acted like his bloodline was superior to everyone else's. I felt a surge of pure rage, and my hands balled into fists at my sides. I couldn't wrap my brain around why Ava would choose to destroy our life like this. As he turned to walk away, I snapped and grabbed him by the arm. I shouted that he was lying and that Ava would never do that to me. Ethan just shoved me off and pulled out a wet wipe, cleaning his arm as if I were covered in some kind of plague. He asked me if I was illiterate and told me to read the report again. He said a man's worth is measured by his self-awareness, and if he were me, he would have skipped town weeks ago. He twisted the knife by saying that Ava wouldn't even touch me if I begged her. Then he pulled out a photo of the two of them together and slapped it against my face before letting it flutter to the floor. He strutted out of the room like he had just won a war, wearing a grin that made me want to kill him. My head was pounding and I couldn't catch my breath. I had to lean against the wall just to keep from collapsing on the spot. The more I tried to calm down, the tighter my chest felt until the world went black. I woke up in a hospital bed with a doctor standing over me, telling me to take slow, deep breaths. The doctor told me I had suffered a severe panic attack and hyperventilated. He said I was lucky I passed out where help was available, or it could have been much worse. He reminded me that no matter what I was going through, my life was worth more than any problem. He told me I only get one life, and I shouldn't throw it away over someone else's mistakes. His words were the wake-up call I needed. I decided right then that I was done being a victim, and it was time for me to fight back. I wasn't going to let Ethan win this game. However, the situation spiraled out of control faster than I could plan. Ava's pregnancy was high risk from the start, and she started showing signs of a miscarriage before she even hit her second trimester. She moved into a private wing of the hospital to try and save Ethan's baby. I took the opportunity to leak the story to the press. Headlines started popping up everywhere about the Sterling family's possible new heir. The timing was perfect because a paparazzi caught Ethan checking her into the clinic. By the time they were settled in her room, the entire internet was exploding with rumors about their affair. People were already doing the math and guessing the baby belonged to Ethan. I have to admit, the internet's ability to sniff out a scandal is impressive. Once the frenzy reached its peak, I decided it was time to make my move. I walked into her hospital suite looking exhausted and disheveled. Ava immediately recoiled and covered her stomach, demanding to know what I was doing there. I just set a thermos down on the table and gave her a small, sad smile. I told her I had made some soup to help her get her strength back. She just stared at it like it was poisoned, so I poured myself a bowl and drank it right in front of her. I showed her the empty bowl to prove it was safe. I told her it wasn't poisoned, and she finally took a few sips of the soup. The press were swarming the lobby, but security was tight enough that they couldn't get anywhere near our private floor. When I finally left the hospital, I made sure to look like a man whose world was falling apart. The moment the elevator doors opened in the lobby, I was hit by a wall of camera flashes. I forced myself to give the reporters a shaky, artificial smile. Reporters were shoving microphones in my face, screaming questions about the baby's father and the nature of Ava's relationship with my brother. I didn't give them a straight answer. I just looked into the nearest lens. I told them that the child would be the heir to both the Sterling and Harrison legacies. I left it at that and walked away, knowing the press would have a field day with those implications. Within 60 minutes, every major tabloid had a story running about the Sterling scandal. They were all speculating that my wife's baby actually belonged to my brother Ethan. What shocked me was that neither Ava nor Ethan tried to confront me about the leak. I was going to investigate why they were being so quiet, but then I overheard them talking through the cracked door of her hospital room. Ava was panicking because she thought I knew the truth about the baby. Ethan just told her to stay calm, saying that once I was dead, all their problems would disappear. I stood in the hallway, my heart racing as I tried to keep from having another panic attack. I had never imagined they were actually capable of murder. Suddenly, the courtroom screen flickered with static and the image began to warp and twist. The judge jumped to his feet and called for the techs. It was the first time a memory feed had ever glitched like that in the middle of a high-profile trial. The technician spent several minutes frantically checking the wires before finally looking up. He explained that the pain of the memories was so intense that my body's natural defense mechanisms were shutting down the feed. The comments section exploded with people saying they had never seen a case this extreme before. People were speculating about how horrific my memories must be to break the equipment. They were clamoring for the feed to continue because they were desperate to know the rest of the story. As the public frenzy grew, Ava stood up and tried to stop the proceedings, claiming that enough had been seen already. Someone in the gallery shouted out, asking her if she even had a soul. The room was still fixated on the image of Ethan falling from the roof and the tragedy of his infertility. Just as the weight of that accusation seemed to crush the room, a young woman's voice cut through the silence. Someone pointed out that the doctor from the hospital was actually in the courtroom. The room erupted into chaos as people wondered if the real story was finally going to come out. One group of commenters was backing me, saying a boy raised by that grandmother couldn't be evil. Others argued that my quiet, repressed nature made me a prime candidate for a sociopath. The internet was a war zone of conflicting opinions. The judge reviewed a new document handed to him by the clerk, adjusted his glasses, and then slammed his gavel to restore order. He announced that Dr. Hannah Miller would be testifying on my behalf. He warned her that if she committed perjury, she would face a life sentence and the total seizure of her assets. Dr. Hannah was hooked up to the machine, and her memories began to fill the screen. It showed Ethan staring at a medical report with a look of pure shock. The lab results stated clearly that he was essentially sterile. It turned out that the miscarriage Ava suffered was likely due to his own genetic issues. That baby had been their only shot, and with his condition, the chances of him ever getting her pregnant again were zero. Hannah had told him that Ava needed immediate surgery or she would die. Ethan was paralyzed by the fear of his secret getting out, more worried about his reputation than her life. He actually asked the doctor if a fall from a building could be blamed for his infertility. I was horrified to realize he had planned to mutilate himself just to frame me. Hannah looked visibly disturbed in the memory. She tried to tell him that his condition was treatable and that he shouldn't do anything drastic. Hannah was Ava's personal physician, and since the hospital was owned by the Harrisons, she was caught in a very dangerous position. She was used to the dark secrets of the elite, but she tried to be the voice of reason. She begged Ethan to just walk away and not go through with his insane plan. She told him there was still hope for a family in the future, but Ethan just snapped. He looked at her with a terrifying, manic hatred and asked her what she could possibly know about his situation. He screamed that he never thought Ava would actually go through with marrying me. He had begged her for years, and he couldn't stand the fact that she had chosen an idiot like me over him. He ranted about our father's will, saying the old man must have had a stroke of conscience. I had been left an extra 15% of the company, which gave me more power in the Sterling Empire than he could ever have. He admitted he only stayed with Ava to force her into a divorce so he could get control of my shares. He mocked her, saying that while she claimed to love him, she was too repressed to actually go through with anything. He confessed to drugging her wine just to get her into bed that first night. He ranted about being a Sterling son too, and how he refused to be second best just because he was born on the wrong side of the sheets. He swore he wouldn't let me have anything. He vented all his rage at Hannah before grabbing his jacket and storming out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The memory shifted back to my hospital room. I looked like a ghost in my gown, my mind stuck in a loop of the moment Ethan dragged me over the edge of that building. It was clear he had tried to kill me. If I hadn't landed on that awning, I would be dead instead of just recovering from a few broken ribs. I didn't even see Hannah come into the room to check on me. She looked over my chart and told the nurses to give me special attention. Not long after, Ethan's self-inflicted injuries were made official, and he was declared sterile for life. A few nights later, I was ambushed in an alley on my way home and stabbed in the stomach. I would have bled out right there if my aunt hadn't found me and called 911. I was in surgery all night, barely clinging to life. While I was fighting for every breath, Ethan was lying in a luxury suite, surrounded by people who treated him like a tragic hero. I was completely alone in that cold bed, dealing with waves of agony from the stabbing. I was still in shock, trying to process the fact that my own brother and wife had actually tried to have me murdered. Then the next blow came. I was served with a subpoena for a life trial, with Ava and Ethan listed as the plaintiffs. Apparently, having me stabbed wasn't enough to satisfy their need for revenge. The very next day, several Sterling subsidiaries sued me for corporate espionage and embezzlement. By the third day, the Harrison family had filed their own massive civil suit against me. They claimed my immoral behavior had tanked their stock prices and demanded I pay for the losses. On the fourth day, I found a bright red wedding invitation tucked inside another stack of legal papers. I tried to drag myself out of bed to confront them, ignoring how weak I was. I didn't even make it 2 steps before I collapsed, ripping my surgical stitches open and soaking my gown in blood. Hannah found me at my absolute breaking point. The people watching the feed were starting to realize how monstrous the Sterling and Harrison families really were. Someone commented that being poor seemed like a blessing compared to this. The memory shifted to Hannah, showing that she had reached her limit with Ethan and Ava's cruelty. She still had a conscience, so she decided to help me fight the mountain of lawsuits they had piled on me. Even though she was under immense pressure, she spent every spare moment helping me gather evidence. We worked through the night, day after day, building my defense. Ava took those meetings and twisted them into a third charge, accusing me of having an affair with Hannah and plotting to drive Ava to suicide. Hannah had known Ava would try something like that. We had made sure never to be truly alone. While it might have looked suspicious from the outside with the curtains drawn, the reality was very different. The internal security footage clearly showed a room full full of nurses, assistants, and lawyers working around the clock. Ava's face in the courtroom was now a mask of pure fury as her lies were exposed. Ethan, who had been so confident, finally shut his mouth. Ava was trembling with rage and slammed a pile of photos and medical records onto the table in front of me. I had almost forgotten about the incident from 6 months ago when I took my cousin to her prenatal appointment. She was the only other grandchild our grandmother had truly loved. She had been abandoned by her boyfriend after getting pregnant. She considered an abortion, but the doctor warned her that this might be her only chance to ever have a child. She decided to keep the baby, but was too terrified to tell her family. I was the only person she trusted, so I went with her to every appointment. I didn't know Ava had hired a private investigator to follow me, desperate for proof of an affair. It didn't matter in the end, because Ethan forced the divorce through anyway, and all of that was ancient history now. Ava stood there and claimed that I had been taking another woman to prenatal visits while we were still married. She pointed out that the baby was already a month old and that we hadn't shared a bed in over a year. Ava knew that if she lost this trial, she was the one going to prison for life. She was backed into a corner and finally blurted out her most guarded secret. She confessed that her uterus was malformed. She claimed that was the only reason she hadn't given me an heir. To save her own skin, she admitted to a secret she had intended to take to her grave. The miscarriage she had with Ethan wasn't just his fault. Her own medical condition had made a successful pregnancy nearly impossible. Her mother had found out about it when Ava was just a teenager and had been hiding it from the family ever since. They both knew the truth, but they were too terrified of what would happen to Ava's status as the sole heir of the Harrison fortune if word got out. Her grandfather had already named her his successor, but that would all change if they knew she couldn't produce an heir. The family would have replaced her with a distant cousin in a heartbeat. It would also give her father a perfect excuse to find a mistress and try for a son. Her mother had fought too hard for her position to let everything be taken away by some outsider. They had decided to keep quiet since the condition didn't affect her daily health. The plan was to wait until she had total control of the company before seeking treatment. They kept putting it off until it was almost too late. That was why she had been hesitant to actually marry Ethan. It was also why she had been so desperate to save that one accidental pregnancy. She had no idea that Ethan was hiding his own medical secrets from her. The judge looked disgusted and ordered the techs to hook Ava up to the machine. The whole ugly truth was finally coming out. Because of her secret, Ava had kept a relationship with Ethan strictly platonic for years. He had proposed countless times, and she had always found a way to say no without telling him why. The press had romanticized it, claiming she was so in love with Ethan that she couldn't bring herself to be with anyone else. They painted her as a tragic heroine who would rather be alone than settle for less than her true love. Eventually, the board of directors started putting on the pressure. Ava needed to get married and provide an heir to secure the family's future. Her enemies in the company were already starting to circle like sharks. Rumors started flying that her relationship with Ethan was a total sham and that she was actually a lesbian. The gossip was starting to hit the Harrison stock price and the overall value of the Sterling merger. She was forced into a corner and had to find a husband immediately to save her reputation. Even though she was still in love with Ethan, she was smart enough to know the stakes. She knew Ethan only wanted her because it helped him crush me and secure his place in the Sterling family. She was terrified of what he would do if he ever found out the truth about her condition. She knew he would turn on her in a heartbeat and expose her secret to the entire world if it suited him. The irony was that despite all her talk of being independent, she was completely under his spell. She was so obsessed with Ethan that she had lost all sense of logic. She couldn't tell him the truth, so she just watched him leave, too afraid to even ask him to stay. That was when she decided to use me. I was the fool who had loved her from afar for years. I will never forget the afternoon she actually asked me to marry her. It was a quiet Sunday, and I was just heading downstairs when I saw her sitting in the living room. My grandma was there too, looking happier than I had ever seen her. Ava ran over and took my hand, blushing as she gave me a kiss. She told my grandma that she had been in love with me for a long time and wanted us to build a life together. The sun was streaming through the trees outside, casting golden light all over her. In that moment, she looked like an absolute angel. I really believed she only had eyes for me. But as the memory feed showed, our marriage was entirely one-sided. I was the only one putting in the effort and the only one who was actually in love. All I got for my devotion was betrayal. Hannah stood up and set the record straight, explaining that the woman in the photos was my cousin and the baby belonged to her ex Hannah through the paternity test onto the judge's bench. The results proved beyond any doubt that I was not the father of that child. The test confirmed the child belonged to my cousin and her former partner. Hannah's father had been the Harrison family's doctor for decades, and his loyalty to them had been absolute. Hannah and Ava had grown up together and were supposed to be best friends. When Ava first got her diagnosis, she hadn't realized how much it would eventually ruin her life. It was her mother's constant whispering and shaming that made Ava feel like she was broken or defective. Over the years, that shame turned into a deep, twisted resentment. Everything came to a head when she fell for Ethan. She was so desperate to keep him that she actually begged Hannah to act as a surrogate for them in secret. Hannah refused, of course. So Ava did the unthinkable. She drugged both Hannah and Ethan and locked them in a room together. She forced them into a situation that neither of them consented to. Hannah was absolutely devastated when she realized what had happened. She wanted to go to the police and have them both arrested for what they did. Ava threatened Hannah's father, who was in the hospital with severe dementia and bipolar disorder. She told Hannah that if she didn't cooperate, her father would lose his care. Her father needed round-the-clock care that Hannah couldn't afford on a fresh medical school graduate salary. Their family savings had already been wiped out by his medical bills. She chose to endure the humiliation for the sake of her father's life. When he finally passed away a few years later, she thought she was finally free of the Harrisons and the Sterlings. She didn't realize Ava had recorded the entire incident. She had the footage and was using it as blackmail to keep Hannah under her thumb for the rest of her life. Ava wouldn't let her go, telling her that since she couldn't have children, Hannah would be the one to provide the Harrison heir. Hannah lived her life in a gilded cage, just waiting for a way out. She spent every day looking for a way to destroy Ava. She was the one who started the rumors about Ava's sexuality, hoping to ruin her standing in the family. That plan failed when Ava married me. My marriage to Ava made the rumors go away, so Hannah had to wait for Ethan to come back. She wanted nothing more than to see the man who had assaulted her destroyed. She wanted to bring them both down at the same time. She spent months manipulating Ethan, telling him he needed to produce an heir with Ava to secure his power. She told him it was the only way to win the family war. In reality, Ava's surgery had actually been successful. Hannah was the only one who knew the truth because of her family's long history with the Harrisons. Everyone assumed Ava's issues were from an old car accident. Hannah used her position to manipulate Ava's recovery, giving the family chef specific instructions on her special diet. The chef didn't dare question the doctor's orders. He had no idea he was actually feeding Ava a cocktail of fertility drugs hidden in her daily soups. Hannah didn't stop at the drugs. She set up a situation where Ava and one of her bodyguards were drugged and trapped together. It was a brutal, calculated move that led to a disastrous outcome. Ava's body wasn't ready for a pregnancy so soon after her surgery. The entire situation was a recipe for disaster, and the pregnancy was doomed from start. Ethan was nothing more than a tool for Hannah. She told the court that she had taken samples after Ava's miscarriage to run her own secret paternity test. Hannah explained everything with a chilling calmness, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She told Ava that the child had been hers, but the father wasn't who she thought. She looked Ava dead in the eye and told her the father wasn't Ethan or me. It was her own head of security. She told Ava to check the internet for the leaked photos of her and the bodyguard before they were taken down. Her voice was like ice as it echoed through the silent courtroom. The entire room was paralyzed with shock. No one said a word for several minutes. It was finally over. Ava and Ethan went from the golden couple of New York to absolute pariahs overnight. As for me, I was finally able to walk out of that courtroom and start piecing my life back together. I told Ava that the world's judgment does not define her, because facing the pain head-on is where her rebirth in Seattle truly begins. The people from the Miller family who tried to bury her had no idea that she was actually a seed waiting to sprout. I hope she brushes the dust off her shoulders and never looks back at those toxic losers, choosing instead to live for the stronger version of herself.